So now, practice. How do you know that you've implemented practice? So we're going to talk about, again, identifying when practice occurs, evaluating whether or not that practice is effective, and then reflecting on your own practice. So we're down here now in the practice section, provide guided independent practice. As you know, there's more to these things, which we'll lay out as we go. So we're going to look at a couple of lessons here. You don't have to see me teach again, I promise you, at least not now. And you're going to look this time in a first grade class. The teacher's teaching about the main idea. You've seen this video before, part of this video before. And the teacher is going to be asking students to identify the main idea in a story using the different steps in the paragraph shrinking strategy.
So we're going to practice today using a photo. So I want us to look at step number one. Step number one is to identify the most important who or what in this photo. Thumb on your knee. You think you found the most important who or what in this photo. Owen?
The girl in the white dress.
Why do you think the girl in the white dress is the most important who or what?
Because she's the only one that's wearing the white dress.
Step number two is to identify the most important information about the who or what. I'm going to give you some think time. So we said the most important who or what is the girl in the white dress. Thumb on your knee if you'd like to share the most important information about the who or what. Aiden?
The most important thing about the who and what is the girl in the white dress getting married.
Who thinks they can help us? Right now we're going to say this information in one short sentence using 10 words or less. That's step number 3. Rachel?
The girl in the white dress is getting married.
The girl in the white dress is getting married. Go ahead and put a thumb on your head if you agree. All right. Now we're going to practice with a different photo, and you're going to talk to your partner about it. I'm going to give you some think time before you turn and talk to your partner. So here's our next photo. Step number 1 is to identify the most important who or what. So I just want you to think. Do you know who the most important who or what is in this photo? Just thinking, that means hands are down, mouths are closed. Step number 2 is to identify the most important information about the who or what. Step number 3 is to write or say the information in one short sentence, 10 words or less. Go ahead and turn and talk to your partner about this photo. What's number 2? What's step number 2? What's step number 1? Step number 1? Okay, who or what is the most important in this photo?
That Miss Angela graduated from high school.
It looks like you already did step number 3. You put all of your information into one sentence. I heard the who or what. That was Miss Andrews, me. And your important information about me is that I'm graduating. And then you put it into one sentence. You can help us share what they and their partner were talking about. Number 1, identify the most important who or what. You can help us with who is the most important or what is the most important. Aiden?
The most important who or what is you graduating with your graduation hat.
Okay, so the most important who you think is me, and you think that because I'm wearing a special hat? Who can help us with number 2, identify the most important information about the who or what? Addison?
The most important information about who or what is that you're graduating.
Can someone help us to say this information in one short sentence, 10 words or less? Eva?
Miss Andrews is graduating.
Can you say it nice and loud for everyone to hear?
Miss Andrews is graduating.
Go ahead and clap once if you agree with Eva.
Okay, so now I've seen a teacher do some practice here. So let's look at it in terms of the different kinds of practice. So when we think about our timestamps, you probably saw her do the guided practice between the beginning and minute 123. That's where we saw some form of guided practice. So let's look at our checklist now to see if this meets the criteria. So the first thing is to lead the students in steps toward the learning outcome, and there are different ways to do that depending on what type of task it is. So what type of task is this actually? This is the paragraph structure strategy, which has the most important who or what, the most important information about the who or what, and then one short sentence that's 10 words or less. So that should be clear to you that it's a procedural task. So the procedural task, the teacher leads the students in steps through the process. So as you could see here in the first example that the teacher is doing with the wedding example, the teacher leads the students step by step through that process. Okay, so that's that one. So did we see appropriate prompts? Well, I think this is a really interesting one in this case. The teacher doesn't provide any prompts when doing the wedding photo. She says the step, the students respond, and they just keep on going. We could say that the teacher includes some mini prompts, mini reminders to pairs. We'll come back to that point a little bit later. We don't see any communication between the teacher and students that indicates prompting. But it's possible here the students didn't really need it. She had presented it pretty clearly, and as a result, perhaps the students didn't need prompting, and she made the decision to limit the amount of prompts. The idea here is to provide appropriate prompts. It's not just to go on and on and on. So if she provided the amount of prompts, the number of prompts, the degree of prompt the students needed, then she's doing a good job. But it's unclear here, so we gave it kind of a circle. Okay? So that's why we would say that one doesn't quite necessarily meet all of our criteria for appropriate prompts, but we're not saying it doesn't either. Now let's look at observing and providing immediate feedback. So she does not really provide any feedback, as I already said a little bit. She listens to response and then moves on. She might repeat it, but she doesn't say whether it's right or not. Sometimes teachers do indicate that a response is correct by just repeating it. But in this case, it's not clear that she's doing it for exactly that reason. And we wouldn't say maybe it was strong enough because we're not sure that she's actually not providing any feedback beyond sort of restating. So it's not probably adequate feedback for the student to shape the student's understanding. Now let's look at the independent practice. So we said that maybe there's independent practice between minute 33 and the end. We said maybe, and let's talk about why that might be. Let's look at our guidelines for independent practice. So in terms of reviewing the expectations for this, you always want to tell the students what you're expecting them to do. The teacher does this by reviewing the steps for the students and giving the students a second to think about what's going on with this next picture that she shows the students. So she reviews all of the pieces one by one with the students. Then the question is whether or not she allows students to work without support. This is an interesting one. Would you count pair practice as a form of independent practice? I think that on margin, I would say it is a form of independent practice because the students are doing it with each other. The one way in which it's not great independent practice is that it's not clear who is actually doing the practice. Independent practice should involve every student doing it. In the pair, it wasn't clear that there were different roles, so it could be that the student who's more capable is doing this. And so let's say one student needs intensive intervention and one does not. The student who needs intensive intervention might not be actually doing anything, actually practicing. They might be just listening to their partner who gets these things more easily, do the practice. So the teacher is, let's say, allowing students to work without support for the most part. She also, though, comes around and provides some targeted assistance. We could count those potentially as mini reminders. So I think we can say that on margin, providing a mini reminder, particularly if the students aren't actually getting the answer from her, that's giving them an opportunity to practice independently. And it might be appropriate from time to time to shape students' understanding by giving them an answer. But mainly you would want to provide immediate and delayed feedback. So what about feedback? Did the teacher provide immediate and delayed feedback and check for student understanding? Well, with regard to the first point, the teacher does check for understanding. After the students work as pairs, she brings them back together and reviews their responses. She doesn't always provide feedback, though, and that's what makes this an interesting example. With the first student, she does provide feedback, and it seems really appropriate in that case because the student wasn't quite sure and kind of repeated the entire thing, and she wanted to reinforce the key idea here was that the most important who is me here, sort of interesting who or what. And so in that case, it was appropriate to provide the prompt because it's going to support the student in understanding. When she looked at the next two students, she provides no feedback. But maybe that's appropriate given that the students might have been getting the answers correct. So it's a little bit hard to tell here whether or not that decision to only provide limited feedback was appropriate. For independent practice, we could say that maybe it was more appropriate to provide less feedback. So overall, we weren't sure, and so we gave that kind of a circle. But it's possible that another interpretation could be that it's a check mark because she maybe is making strategic decisions about whether to provide feedback. So let's look at another example to see whether or not this is actually an example of independent practice. So in this case, the teacher in first grade is teaching students to code words in isolation and in texts. And students are doing this with letter cards and pocket charts that you'll see in the video. So let's watch this teacher do practice and let's see whether or not it meets our criteria for effective practice. So this is going to be a chance for you to think about it a little bit more on your own. So here we go.
So when I touch under E, you're going to say E.
E. E.
I'm going to put the S and the D back. When I do my finger under the word, you're going to say the whole word, seed. And when I touch under the E, you're going to say E. So let's try it a few times.
Seed. E. Seed. E.
Good. Right. This word is meat. What word is it?
Meat.
In meat, there's EA in the middle. And most of the time when EA is together, it also represents the long E sound, the sound in the middle of meat. So it says E. So when I touch under EA, I want you to say E.
E. E.
When I do my finger under, I want you to read the whole word.
Meat. E. Meat. E.
Good. All right, so we're going to practice reading both words now. And when I touch under just the EA or the EE, you'll say E.
Meat. Seed. E. E. Meat. Seed. E. E.
Good. I like how you're reading it so nicely. I'm going to give you a word list now. And on the word list, you're going to take your pencil and you're going to underline any time you see EA or EE together. Sometimes there's going to be just an E by itself. That's going to be the short E sound, and it's going to say eh. And some words won't have any E's in it at all. So just underline the EE or the EA for the long E sound. And you can practice reading the words in your head while you do that. And actually, could you say E every time you underline it?
E. 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 E.
We're going to read the words together now. And we're going to sound it first, and then we'll read it. So we'll say eat, and then read meat. Okay, so let's start at the top, and we're going to go down the first column. You can point with your finger or with your pencil. So let's start at the first word. Ready?
Eat. Meat. Ear. Here.
Let's start at the top of the next column.
At. Met.
EA says E, so try that one again. Sound it.
Beak. Beak. At. Mat. Tree. Tree. Et. Bet.
So you did a nice job of reading the words, and so now I'm going to give you a little story, and it's called Up in the Trees. And the first thing you're going to do is you're going to look through it and see what words you can find that have the EA or the EE. And you're going to underline them and read them as you do that, okay? Can you say the sound E when you underline it too?
Mm-hmm. E.
So what words did you find in the story that had the EA or the EE? Addison, what did you find?
I found C. Lots of parts of the book.
C. Good. Aspen?
I saw easy on most of the pages.
Good. Easy is one word.
Tree.
Trees.
Easy.
Mhm.
C.
There's one more that we haven't said yet. You can look through and see. We said easy, C, tree. Aspen?
I forgot.
Addison?
Here.
Here is in there too.
So now let's look at those timestamps to see whether we saw guided independent practice. So here are the timestamps that we came up with, our timestamps, here they are. And you'll see here that our guided independent practice are actually quite short. And that's exactly what we would expect in lessons like this, is remember that an explicit instruction lesson, it doesn't have to be wrong to be good. So now let's look at the guided practice, first in terms of leading students toward the learning outcome. Here, the key actual guided practice is around the units of knowledge, which are the letter sounds EE and EA. The teacher has an expectation that students actually know how to sound out the words using the meet strategy and so on. So she doesn't actually spend a lot of time on that. In fact, that part of the lesson is mostly independent practice. But what she does is she tells the students what the letters are and letters say in this lesson. And that makes it a knowledge task. So how well does she lead the students toward the learning outcome, which is identifying that EE and EA say E? Well, she provides very clear directions for that, and she tells students what to do. When you say EE, when I point to EE, I want you to say E, and then when I point to EA, I want you to say E, and so on. So she actually very clearly addresses the knowledge task with the students. So we give her a check for that. So what about the appropriateness of the prompts? The teacher provides really simple gestural prompts for the students, and that's exactly what we would expect to see for the students, because there's not much else that needs to be done. They're perfectly appropriate. They're quick, they're simple, and that's what we want to see. Now let's talk about the feedback that the teacher provides. So here it's a little bit tricky, and so we're going to give her a circle just like we did the last teacher. Now, the teacher should be watching the students carefully and providing responses. The teacher doesn't actually provide much feedback besides just saying good at the end. It's also the case the students don't make any errors. So it's hard to know in this case whether or not the teacher should have provided more feedback. What we might say is that the teacher could have done a little better job by reinforcing at the end, saying something just besides good, because we want to have the teacher reinforce the exact behavior by restating it. So we didn't see that. But otherwise, it seems like it might have been appropriate. So we're going to give that a good old circle. Now let's move on to the independent practice. So again, you see our timestamps here, and you can see we had 3 instances of independent practice in this lesson. Quite a lot of the lesson was actually independent practice. So let's talk about whether or not it met the criteria for that. All right, so now let's take a look at whether or not the teacher is doing good independent practice. First, let's talk about whether or not the teacher reviews expectations and resources for the learning outcome linked to the guided practice. So here, we actually have to give her kind of a circle. Why? Think about the activity they did for independent practice. Is it the same as the activity they did during guided practice? The answer is no. Guided practice was all about the students restating what she had just modeled. So I'm going to say E, you say E. She's guiding them through that part of the lesson. But when she then gets to having the students do things on their own, they're not saying the letter sound alone, they're actually applying it to word reading, with which she does not help them. So it seems like it actually might be appropriate. The students are quite accurate. And it's a routine that the students already know. They've done this before with word reading. So perhaps it's wholly appropriate that the teacher is having the students do it this way. But we can't say that with certainty. We can say that the students seem to be accurate also, but we again don't know for sure. So overall, we got to give that a circle. Now let's move on to allowing the students to work without support. Teacher absolutely does this. So she provides little reminders to students as they go, as she sees it's appropriate, but she does not provide extensive guidance. She allows students to do it on their own, but she's constantly monitoring and giving those mini reminders exactly like we'd expect during good independent practice. Finally, let's talk about observing and providing immediate and delayed feedback. We're going to give this a check also. After they practice, the teacher goes back to go over it with the students. When they've mastered the first task, she has a different task for them to apply it for them to apply the knowledge, and now they're going to do it in a book. At this point, it's not a problem at all because they've already practiced word reading within words. They've already done word reading within words. Now they're ready to apply it to text because the remainder of the text is not going to be difficult for them. It's going to be words students already know. What they're going to be focusing on are those new words, and it's totally appropriate to be moving into that area. So I think we can say for sure that the teacher is providing feedback, following the completion of the task, and then getting right into the next one. That's also independent practice, and they continue doing that, and she provides the feedback afterwards as well. So overall, we can give the teacher a couple of checks here. We'll say that there are places in which the teacher did not exactly meet all the expectations, but we sometimes won't see exactly that. And sometimes we won't know whether or not we've actually met the expectation. As in this case, we don't know whether or not the students needed the feedback like we talked about. So overall, this lesson meets a lot of the checklist criteria. So let's close up this part about guided independent practice by reminding you that it's important to understand the difference between guided practice, to know when students are ready for independent practice, and to use the checklist to create a practice plan. So now we want to give you a chance to try it out. So first, you're going to prepare a lesson. You're going to review the lesson you want to teach, and you're going to figure out whether or not you need to guided practice, independent practice, or both. For a more complex skill, it's likely you might only in a short lesson, because we want you to do about 10 minutes, you might only focus on just one small section of it and thus only do guided practice. If you're doing something very short and simple, much like you saw in the second video, then it would be appropriate to do both guided and independent practice. And of course, then we're going to ask you to plan the lesson carefully, focused on these aspects of it, and then actually execute the lesson while videotaping it so you can get a sense of what you actually did. And finally, critical to self-reflect. Look back at the video after you've recorded it to see whether or not you see evidence of following the checklist in those cases. What did you see? Evaluate your use of practice using the checklist, and then meet with a coach or a peer or instructor to help you talk more about that. And you have there's a guide from the coach can use, or your instructor can use, or a peer can use to help you think about that. So now you've had a chance to think about practice. So we're ready for the next piece.